This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the best way to make an amazing website. Hey guys, it's Max. In this video, I'm gonna give you guys my final opinions on the new 2020 5K iMacs, specifically for video editors. So we're gonna take a look at numbers for Premiere Pro, Final Cut Pro, and DaVinci Resolve. And now I'll let you guys know if you should be buying this Mac or if you should wait for something else. And for those of you that are gonna buy one, I have a few tips that will save you at least $400 and possibly up to $900 while still getting the same exact performance depending on what kind of codec you work with and what program you work with. Now, of course, what kind of review is it if we don't have some comparisons to other computers? So I'll be comparing to the iMac Pro as well as my $15,000 Mac Pro. And I guess I'll just put it out there, I don't need that Mac Pro anymore. This iMac really is close to as fast and in some cases faster. Now, before getting into performance numbers, I want to talk about some other differences that have been really nice. First off, for the first time in a regular iMac, we have a 1080p webcam, and I think it's been long enough. The only other iMac that has one of these is the iMac Pro. Now, along with that, we also have 10 gigabit Ethernet for $99 more, and for professional use, I would say absolutely get it, even if you're not using it right now. Because of this, we no longer have to use $200 Thunderbolt 3 adapters that give you 10 gig Ethernet. We can connect to our QNAP and edit, which is really, really nice. The SD card slot is now UHS 2, which means you're gonna get full performance, just like the iMac Pro. And the last thing is that we finally have a T2 chip. The 2019 iMac was the last Apple computer that didn't have one, and because of that, some things were really slow, so I'm glad they finally added this in. Now here are the full specs to my machine, but once again, I have some suggestions for you guys if you're gonna order one, so make sure to stick around. Now this thing has 64 gigs of RAM, and I put it in myself. It took me about 2 minutes, and I saved, I believe, $700 compared to Apple, and you can save a lot more than that if you want 128 gig. Now I did test 128, and for most things there is no difference, so 64 gigs is the sweet spot. I'll go ahead and link the RAM that I used along with my RAM install guide down in the video description below. Now let's jump into performance, and we're gonna start off with Cinebench R20, and I was really surprised to see that this i9 10 core actually beat out my 12 core Xeon in the Mac Pro, and this applies for things like rendering most of the time. I do have some R5 transcoding numbers to compare between these machines for you guys in just a bit. Now when we switch over to Geekbench 5, which does a huge variety of tests of small CPU loads and big ones, here the Mac Pro does start to win out, but this iMac is faster than my iMac Pro. And switching over to Geekbench 5 Metal Graphics Performance, it scored about 57,000. Now I have to be honest that I was slightly disappointed because this same exact graphics card, the 5700 XT, inside of the Mac Pro scores about 75 to 80. So it's clear that Apple is throttling this card in this iMac because we have just one fan. It's a much smaller system. But with that, it does beat out my Vega 56 in the iMac Pro. Now before we get into the actual video editing results, we're gonna take a look at BlackMagic RAW, ProRes, we're gonna take a look at a wide variety of different codecs. Let me give a shout out to the sponsor of this video, Squarespace. If you've been thinking about making a website or upgrading your old outdated one, Squarespace is seriously the best way to go. We've built multiple websites, and you can too with literally no web making experience. You just choose a template, customize blocks of text and images, and easily move them around. It's incredibly simple, it's affordable, and they run flawlessly for years without having to do anything. It just works. And with that, clients will actually find your website because of the built-in SEO tools. So whether you're making a website for a small business or literally anything else, go to squarespace.com/maxyuryev or use the link below for a free, no credit card required trial. And when you're ready to launch, you'll save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Let's start off with Bruce X, and this tests your rendering performance of your graphics card. And here the Mac Pro is faster, but keep in mind the graphics card itself is about $2,800, close to this whole machine, but this does beat out the iMac Pro. Now onto 4K stabilization, I'm using a 20-second clip, and in Final Cut, the performance is the same as my Mac Pro. In DaVinci Resolve, it is just slightly behind, and Premiere, even with the latest updates, it is still extremely slow, about the same with all the systems. Now I went ahead and tested H.265 stabilization because a lot of cameras are shooting this now, and the difference was crazy. I got 8.5 seconds for a 1 minute 4K clip compared to 14 seconds on the Mac Pro. Pro. Now, why do we have such a big difference? Well, this 5700 XT graphics card, it is the latest from AMD. They do have a couple new graphics cards coming out, but as of this moment, it is newer, and the decoders for the H.265 are much better. So if you work with this footage, this iMac screams. Now, if you work with standard H.264 footage from the A7 III or a bunch of other cameras, this iMac renders that slightly slower than the Mac Pro, but it is once again very close. And as far as timeline smoothness, it is amazing. I can't tell the difference compared to my Mac Pro. And the same thing goes if you're editing 8-bit H.265. The smoothness is great. Now, for those of you guys that are working with HDR footage, I have H.265. This is 10-bit. And here, as far as exporting, Final Cut is still insanely slow. Even though this is their machine, this graphics card, it has encoders to make it incredibly fast. And if you guys see DaVinci Resolve, the speed is insane. This is a 5-minute project, and it's basically just as fast as the Mac Pro. And then in Premiere Pro, this iMac is actually slightly faster, but still really slow compared to DaVinci Resolve. And I have to say, come on guys, Apple and Adobe, fix this. It's been long enough. I know the hardware is capable, DaVinci Resolve is making use of it. And now let's talk about R5 footage, which I've been working with. If you want to shoot C-Log, which I do because it looks great, you get the best dynamic range and it's easy to grade, you're shooting with H.265 10-bit 422, and this codec is a pain to edit. This is probably the biggest complaint about the R5. Now, surprisingly, this iMac actually edits a little bit smoother than my Mac Pro. And if you're shooting UHD IPB, you can actually play it back perfectly fine. I actually did a dedicated video on this if you guys want to see more. I'll link in the video description. My Mac Pro, on the other hand, stutters a little bit using this footage, even though it's way more expensive. So there's something about the system, maybe the higher clock speeds, that are helping out. Now, for those of you guys that bought one of these, definitely check out the IPB. Typically, all eye compression is easier to edit, but in my testing, I found that that is not the case. Now, most people are gonna be transcoding because once you transcode, it edits really great in ProRes or other formats like Cineform, and I wanted to test out the difference in transcoding speed. So I transcoded 30 minutes of footage, and my Mac Pro took 30 minutes, and this iMac Pro took 37 minutes and 30 seconds. This is where I said that transcoding kind of varies. It's not the same as Cinebench, so it is slightly slower, but keep in mind, this system is, I think, $3,300, and I wouldn't even buy this exact one. I'd buy a cheaper one, whereas the Mac Pro is incredibly, incredibly expensive. And now let's talk about Canon RAW footage from the C200 or maybe the new C70. And if you're shooting 4K, playback is actually great. You get a perfect 60 frames per second in Final Cut. DaVinci Resolve is actually better. Premiere Pro is a little bit behind, but overall, the Mac Pro does have more overhead, so you can play back probably 3 streams of 24 frames per second with a LUT applied, but this thing isn't that far off, and it does edit better than my iMac Pro. And as far as exporting, in DaVinci Resolve and Premiere Pro, the times are the same as my Mac Pro, and in Final Cut, it is just slightly slower. So you're probably starting to see a trend here. This thing is right there with the Mac Pro, which makes that system hard to justify unless you know that you're gonna be upgrading it years from now, and iMacs have incredible resale. So personally, you can keep this for a year or two, sell it, not lose that much money, and then upgrade to Apple Silicon once this 27-inch or 30-inch, whatever they decide to make, is out, and that's what I'm gonna be doing. Now, I also want to mention 6K. If you're one of the people out there with a C500 Mark II that shoots 6K Canon RAW, don't expect this system to play it back. Even this maxed out one, there's just not enough graphics performance. That's where the Mac Pro will do better if you're getting those high-end graphics cards like the Vega 2 that I have, and then you'll be able to just kind of squeak by, unless you maybe have a couple of them. The 6K footage takes a lot of power to use. And now for 8K RAW, as far as playback, we need more graphics performance. So this is where the Mac Pro could come in. And as far as exporting, all the programs actually took the same amount of time, and this iMac was actually slightly faster than my Mac Pro in Final Cut. Now let's get into some other RAW codecs, such as ProRes RAW and BlackMagic RAW. Now, one great thing about the Mac Pro is you can buy the Afterburner card, which is $2,000, and then you can play back 4 streams of 8K ProRes ProRes RAW without even touching the CPU. And without that, the machine can actually play back one stream of 8K, and I know 8K is crazy, but it is possible. And this iMac will also do the same exact one stream of 8K. And I know some of you guys ask about eGPU support for the Afterburner. I did test it, and no, it doesn't work. Now, as far as exporting this 8K ProRes to 4K, the performance of the Mac Pro with Afterburner is faster, but if you don't have the Afterburner, surprisingly, the performance is almost identical. And as far as BlackMagic RAW, this system chews through it, both in DaVinci Resolve, which it's so easy for. In Premiere Pro, it does take a little bit more hardware as far as the resources, but it still is great, and it is just slightly slower than my Mac Pro. And then finally, to finish it off, let's talk about noise reduction in DaVinci Resolve. This is a 4K Blackmagic RAW clip, and I can actually play it back with spatial and temporal noise reduction at 13 frames per second, so slightly better than the iMac Pro, and a little bit behind the 19 frames per second with the latest update of the Mac Pro. So there you guys go. You guys see all these numbers, and just to sum it up, overall, this system is killer for the money. I'm gonna be selling my Mac Pro. I have a couple buyers, and if you're watching this, I'm gonna get back to you very shortly. And there's still a reason to buy a Mac Pro, like I said, upgradability down the line. And if you need really high-end performance with afterburners or multiple afterburners using add-in cards like Blackmagic Decklink cards, multiple graphics cards, 28-core CPUs, that kind of stuff. But for most people out there, this iMac Pro does more than enough. And now we finally have support for 10 gigabit Ethernet, which we didn't have. We have some other upgrades, and we have better graphics cards as well. Now, I did mention earlier that if you're somebody that wants to buy one, I have a couple suggestions. Well, the first suggestion is don't buy this 10-core CPU. It's a $400 upgrade, and for some reason, and I know the reason, the 8-core is pretty much just as fast. So if I was to do it again, I would not buy the 10-core. We do have a video on MaxTech comparing both, and because the 8-core kind of clocks higher and allows more wattage, it performs basically the same. Now, my other suggestion is a lot of you guys don't actually need the 5700 XT, which is a $500 upgrade. Our other 2020 5K iMac has the 5500 XT, 8 gigabytes, and for those of you guys editing H.264 or 8-bit H.265, and maybe even 10-bit with transcoding, the performance is very, very similar. You only start to see a difference if you're doing these higher end RAW codecs. So for most of you guys, I would save $900 and get that system. And then of course, in the future, you can upgrade to Apple Silicon, which hopefully will support the R5's really tough footage. Now, the biggest dilemma is, should you buy one of these right now or should you wait? Now, personally, I know the Apple Silicon ones are coming and I'm gonna buy it, but I decided to just buy the system. The resale value on these are fantastic. My previous 2017, I had that for 3 or 3.5 years, and I think it cost me about $900 for that time span, which is really cheap for a business. And then I sold it, and then I upgraded to a newer one. So if you need a system that will edit great right now, I think it's worth the money because a lot of you guys spend so much money on lenses and cameras, but then you struggle when you're video editing and you waste a lot of time. And as we know, time is money. Overall, I've been extremely happy other than buying that 10-core when the 8-core is just as fast. That's kind of my frustration, so don't make the same mistake I did. Once again, thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. If you have an old website or you just need to get one, go and check them out. A credit card is not required to check out the trial, so give them a shot. Thank you guys for watching. This has been Max, and I will see you in the next video.